Welcome to Storytelling.
This week's guest is a globally recognised transformation coach with over 30 years of experience empowering educators, leaders and individuals to live with purpose and authenticity. He is a powerful advocate for supporting women to never again be powerless in the face of the patriarchy and insecure men in authority, while helping men understand the transformational power of their gentleness in a society shaped by patriarchal norms. His mission is to create a ripple effect of positive change, guiding people toward lives of purpose and fulfilment. Please welcome James Dakin. Hello, James, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
James, you often work with women dealing with the kind of men you once were. How has confronting your own past informed your coaching methods and your message in general?
That is a blindingly good question. It's true. So I now do say to people that I spend much of my time coaching women from Australia through to America and Europe and Africa. And I am largely coaching them all to cope with the caliber of man that I used to be. That really confuses a lot of men, but it doesn't confuse women. And it's an interesting one. So I grew up in the 70s. In the north of England with a very alcoholic and abusive father who was, in terms of his attitude towards women in life, very much of his generation. For any man growing up in the 70s, 80s, and possibly early 90s, we grew up in a very patriarchal society. The men had to behave in a certain way, and as small boys would be taught, real men don't cry, for example, and men don't play with dolls. That whole messaging. And then the other messaging was the men would retire to talk about the important things and the women would go and gossip. And these were stereotypical messages that was just normal. And so as a small boy, not knowing anything different, that's what I grew up with. And so on the receiving end of that, as a boy growing up into a man, I grew up into a very insecure young adult who had a whole heap of white males sort of supremacy, my right kind of belief without knowing that's what they were because it was normal. And with views on women that women were very much supportive in a supporting role and their job was to be quiet in the background because, of course, that's the message that girls were being given in that generation growing up. And so the patriarchy really has and continues to cause havoc amongst boys and girls by stereotyping everybody into a role which is really unhealthy. Growing up as I did, I became that man. Now, what I didn't understand at the time was that's based on fear. It's based on the fear of how I'll be perceived if I do something differently. So as a man, I grew up with fear that if I got married, women would take everything. I mean, that was the message. And I remember to this day really believing that. Which is ironic because growing up, I had nothing to take, but I still had this inbuilt fear that when I became famous, when I did whatever I was going to do, I was going to lose everything. And it was only when I had a daughter that my ex, who's now my closest friend, who's the mother of my children, I'm very lucky to have such an amazing relationship. My ex and having a daughter and then a son was the start of me beginning to be given the opportunity to look at who I was and my belief system. And I've shared this openly before. The most excruciating and uncomfortable thing I've ever had to do was to look at myself honestly and discover that my attitudes towards what I assumed was my right and my views of women and my views of myself, for that matter, were massively based on being chronically insecure and fearful. It was the most excruciating experience I've ever had. Looking at myself and seeing what I was and thinking, I don't want my daughter ever to have to deal with that caliber of man. I don't want my son to ever grow up into that caliber of man. that had a really profound impact on me. And ever since then, I mean, my kids are what, sort of 12 and 14. So for the last 1.5 decades, roughly, I've been working on what it means to be me, what it means to be a man in today's society, what it means to be a father and a partner, and all of the roles we play, a son, and how that impacts what I do. Life has, over the last, I'd say the last year in particular, has been giving me women of the most, I mean, extraordinary women, women who have built companies up to hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, amazing mothers and wives, extraordinary women across the board. And they are finding me to ask me if I can coach them. And it's around things, how do I get my voice back? What do I really want to do with my life? I mean, having that conversation with a lady whose business is over $50 million, it's her business. She started it. She's an extraordinary lady in America, going, but I'm bored and I don't know what to do. What's my life's purpose? And for me to go, well, I think you're playing small. And have her go, oh my God, that's it. And in spite of her following the path that she wanted to follow, hugely successfully, as a woman, as a person, she now feels and is beginning to register there is so much more to her. And that conversation I'm having with women mostly, and some men, all over the world. And that's really changing how I work with people, which alludes back to your question, because I'm able to hold up the mirror to them and say, well, how are you being? Where are you in your life? What are you doing with it? Where is your excitement? Where do you feel fulfilled? And then, what would you be doing if you weren't playing small? And it's questions like that, which I had never asked before, because, of course, I was doing all of those things without realizing it. So it's only by deciding to stop playing small, by looking at what really gives me passion, what really gives me fulfillment, that I bring that into my coaching now. And when women say to me, how do I deal with this? How do I deal with that? In terms of invariably, it's a male that they're dealing with. It's now giving me insight into how I can help them do that, because having been him, I can be the translation service to say, I recognize exactly what you're up against. So here's what you need to say. Here's how you need to say it. And then you will turn the tables and you'll go from having a really disrespectful relationship with this individual where you don't feel seen or heard or valued or appreciated or included. We can get all of that to happen now if you do these things. And then that began to happen. I mean, it was awesome. I was making this up as I went along based on what I thought might work. And then I've got these incredible women coming back to me going, oh my God, James, it worked amazingly. He has a personality. That was one I heard last week. I did what you said, and I've discovered he has a personality now. He talks to me. And I'm saying, so how do you feel about that? He goes, well, it's just made the world of difference. I now enjoy my reports to him. I enjoy my meetings with him. And he won't have a clue that he's changed. And he won't have a clue why he's changed. But he's changed because she specifically went in with a different approach and a different technique. And now he feels completely as though he's talking to someone like himself. So he's relaxed, exactly where she wants him to be. So she has the quality of relationship she wants. And that, in a very long-winded way, to your incredible question, is how it's changed what I do now. My own personal journey has been reflected in the quality of amazing women and men that I now work with, both corporatively and privately. They're going hand in hand. I do the work, I discover something, I share it, it works. Wow, I learn that, I incorporate it, I share it, it works. And so it's a loop. I learn all the time from these amazing people, and I just share what I learn and what I've created.
So you said something really quite profound. It was several things actually, but I just want to go back to what you said initially when you said that what you do confuses men. And also, when did you have that moment where you thought, actually, I've just woken up, I need to do something about this?
So if I go for the latter first, so I can't remember if there was a particular moment, but I can remember with my ex, the mother of my children, having many discussions and arguments where I realized that I was arguing in order to show that I was not wrong. I was holding a place out of pure, I would call it now, wounded ego or chronic insecurity, where I couldn't admit that I was wrong. Or I had done something which had upset her, angered her, hurt her, or in other words, just made her feel sort of just generally annoyed. And she'd call me on it and go, "You've just done this, haven't you?" No, I haven't. No, I haven't. And I mean, that was my default program. She could give me 8 points in a statement of what I'd done wrong, and I would hone in on the one that I think I could escape from. And I would ignore the enormous picture that she had just painted, and I'd have gone into a tiny bit of detail. And she would say to me, "It's the most infuriating thing you do, because I never feel heard and I never feel validated." I would be going down the road of, but look, I don't want to look at that. It's painful for me. It will make me sound less than I want to be, less than I believe I should be, less than I believe I am. Because the insecurity runs, I'm not worthy. I'm not worth it. I'm not worth it. I'm not worthy. I'm not good enough, clever enough, intelligent enough, attractive enough, rich enough. It comes in many guises, but fundamentally, I'm not enough is one of the two core root beliefs. The other one being, I'm not lovable. And those two limiting beliefs tend to sit at the bottom of any limiting belief you can show me. So I had both running. I had, I'm not lovable and I'm not good enough, running very, very powerfully. And it would just make me defensive. So if she called me on something which I would be embarrassed about, I would be upset to have been caught out about, because it would make me look less than I wanted to be, I would argue and fight tooth and nail, rather than just say, "Geez, you're right. I am really sorry. How can I put this right?" Or "How can we talk through?" And I don't remember a particular moment. I remember many moments. It got to a critical mass. I was doing a lot of work on me anyway, and I will be a work in progress for the rest of my life. Because having grown up with everything I grew up with, there's a lot to undo. And this white male bias, the white male privilege, which will be both conscious and unconscious in any boy growing up, and girls growing up will have the equal and the opposite of that. It's uncovering stuff which I've spent a lifetime putting in place. So that probably happened about, like I said, 12 to 15 years ago, that critical mass built. And then over the last, I'm going to say it's over the last 1 to 2 years that I've become so much more comfortable in my own skin, so much more confident in who I am, that I am much, much more able to hold that conversation now. And I would love to say I'm really comfortable with it. That'd be a direct lie, Debbie, because I'd still, oh no. But I find it so much easier now to go, yep, I'm right. My defense mechanism can still be triggered if I feel attacked over it. And that's the thing. If someone says, "You're wrong, you're this, you're this, you're this," it is instinctive to go into the no. And then one of the ways I learned around that was when I had another partner later who had a very different approach. She would either just sit me down and say, "Listen, can we have a chat?" and put it on the table gently, or write it to me. So I'd have a chance to go, "Rah! She's right. She has a point." And then we would talk about it. And so I began to discover there were ways in which, if I had done something stupid, a woman could make me see it without triggering my wounded ego, pride, insecurity, little boy or teenager, call it what you want. And then I began to appreciate there are ways in which this conversation can have for people who come from that wounded male, that wounded patriarchal side. And the greatest irony of it all was that the people I was most scared about, women with my background, were the very people that could help me change and stay at the table. But I never knew what was happening until I began to really think about it and settle into it. And so that's what I teach a lot of women today. because the moment you go up against me and make me feel wrong, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't, and there are many times where it's really important to do that, but if you want the insecure male, and the word insecure is the primary one here, if you want an insecure man to remain open so that you can have the conversation with them, so you can help them make the progress that you want to have with them, then you have to find a way of doing it without triggering their defense mechanism. Because insecure men have got so many ways of dismissing women. They can't be wrong, so it has to be the woman. The insecure man can't admit they're wrong, so we've invented many, many, many ways. You're hormonal, she's difficult. Well, no, she's just standing up for herself. But we have so many ways of dismissing it, and the moment we do that, you cannot make progress. So much of the work I do now is how to keep the man at the table. And the beautiful thing about this is that whilst the men try to subjugate the women and keep them small and in their place and all of that nonsense that I grew up with, which is still very prevalent today, as we know from watching the American election. But the really fascinating part for me in this is men have made themselves out to be this big, strong thing that controls everything and makes the important decisions. And yet we've got the male ego, which is the most fragile thing in the world. And who are the best exponents at being able to utilize it in a way that's beneficial for them? Women. Because the male ego is so fragile that, and in the insecure man, once you know how to influence it, then you can basically get a man to do anything you want, within reason. And when people say, no, that can't be right, I say, well, when I train this to a mixed groups of adults, after lunch, the women will come back and they go, oh my God, it's just worked on Bob over there. And Bob will just be smiling. And he'll go, wow, yeah, no, it did. Oh, it just feels good. Because when you time it right, everybody wins. The man feels really good about what's happened because he's just got some attention, some compliments, and he feels really good. He's got no idea that he's just changed his entire behavior towards the woman. The woman wins because she's now getting the quality of relationship that she wants to have. Respectful, understanding, considerate. Everybody wins. So it's fascinating for me how the people who have purported to be this big, strong thing actually now are easily undone. And I heard a fascinating thing the other day, which a female colleague who is Hungarian, she was saying to me, of course, men always got their security from their muscle mass or their bank account. Historically, I am the protector, both physically and financially. Whereas now women can do both of those for themselves. So men now get their security from providing a psychological and emotionally safe environment into which the woman can feel completely safe and therefore loves the man and respects the man. Women go, yeah, that's right. I can do it all. All I want is for him to listen. And men are going, I am completely lost. I don't know what to do because my muscle mass and my bank account don't seem to be making a difference and I've run out of options. And I just thought that was a really fascinating way of explaining it in a way that I understood and people that I share it with now seem to get as well.
So communication is key, or the different types of communication is key. And you previously mentioned that one of your clients managed to notice that her co-worker had a personality, for example. And you mentioned the different types of transformative communication between men and women. Can you give an example, just a brief example of a situation or a conversation that one might have?
Yes, because I've just created an online program called Healing the Divide, which focuses on this. And actually, the example I'll share with you is the moment that I realized I had something that I could offer many, many women because it was happening enough. And then this one experience happened. So I had a colleague that I was working with who's early 30s, an engineer in the rail industry. So a very fairly male-dominated skill in a male-dominated environment. And she's an amazing lady. And she's very much on the ascendancy on the way up. And she called me up to say, look, James, I've just had a superior male engineer call me up on a Saturday morning. And his first words down the phone to me were, your equipment has failed in Derby. And she knew that her equipment hadn't failed. But she said that he came at me with such a bombastic, definitive way that she said my brain got scrambled, and I spent half an hour justifying myself and explaining, and I felt really dreadful afterwards. How did you feel? She goes, well, I just felt I had no energy left. I'd given all of it away. And I said, well, okay, so let's work on this. So we worked on the quality, which is curiosity. Now, curiosity is one of those fascinating things that if you really, really practice it, you can't be upset by what's been said to you. So just have a think about it. If somebody says something to you which you find offensive or hurtful or belittling, and it can both be meant and unmeant, of course. The man might do this without having any realization, and you get triggered by it. Well, if you switch from being triggered to being curious as to what they mean, why they mean it, and why they think it's correct, and you genuinely become curious, you can't feel any of those previous emotions because it's no longer about you, it's about them. So I said, okay, so the next time he calls you up and comes out with some outrageous statement or blanket statement or definitive statement, just hit him with this phrase. That's a really interesting phrase you've just used. Now, the insecure male will instantly go onto red alert because you've not bowed down and said, yes, Lord and Master. You've not shown fear and become all insecure. You've come out with a thoughtful statement that's now going to give him pause to think. So that's a really interesting statement. And then, depending on the situation, you can use one of the two following statements. Can I just ask, what evidence do you have that gives you the confidence to come and speak to me like that? Now, that is a very, very non-confrontational way of saying, I don't think you're right and you got your facts right, but you've not told him he's wrong. Especially if you then add the phrase which I teach people, which is, because I completely disagree with what you've said, but I could be wrong. Now, when you say because I could be wrong, you take the moral high ground so that if they're correct, and this does kind of require you to be good at your job and know what you're doing. But I'm going to assume that's the case. I'm going to assume you're highly competent. If they have come across a piece of information that, in fact, they are correct, because you said, I disagree, but I could be wrong, and they go, but I've just had a call with Clive and he's confirmed that this has happened, you can go, it must have been this morning. There's no loss of face. But what you're doing is saying, what's the evidence? Or what are the assumptions behind what assumptions have to be true for you in order to feel confident enough to come at me with that statement? Now, more often than not, it's a lazy statement. And they've not really done any research. And what you do by asking them to give you the evidence or give you the assumptions, instantly you've turned the tables on them. They're no longer questioning you. They're now on the back foot trying to work out, do I really actually have enough? Or have I assumed that, Bob said to me, there's a points failure. I assume it's yours. So Bob's told you. Is Bob always right enough for you to risk becoming public? Because the last thing I would ever want was for you to risk your reputation on accusing anybody publicly and be found not to be right. And what we do then is, having said, use curiosity to say, what do you think the problem is? Where's your evidence? What are your assumptions? We've gone all the way now to being their champion, because the last thing I would want you to ever risk is your reputation, because you're amazing at what you do. I love working with you. And I know how important your reputation is and how hard you work to get there. But if you come out with this sort of thing and you were ever to do it public, you'd force me in a position to basically show the fact that you're wrong. And I would never want to do that. So next time, why don't you come and talk to me about it first? So she went away and she had another conversation with this senior male engineer. And then about 3 weeks later, she called me back and said, James, you'll never guess what's just happened. To which, of course, I'm going, well, it's going to take me a while unless you give me something. But, what's happened? She goes, well, he's just called me back again and you'll never guess what he opened up with. I said, well, I'll go with hello. And she goes, well, yes. But his first phrase to me, remember, this is the guy that had called up and said, as his first words on the call, Your equipment has failed. Bang, 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 bang. I'm right, you're wrong. Therefore, do something about it. And the equipment wasn't wrong, by the way. There was nothing wrong with her equipment. She said to me, he called me up and he started off with, hi, with her name. What do you know about this situation I've just been told about? And she said, I almost had to sit down. What that enabled me to do, because he had asked me a question, because he had discovered that actually he shouldn't just come out with this sort of stuff. I was able to give him everything I knew instantly, very quickly, shape the direction he needed to go in, inform what he needed to do in terms of action. So he left the call with me praising him, because she'd said the other thing she'd said at the end was, do you know, and she used his name, do you know, I've really enjoyed this call because you asked me about a situation and I've been able to explain it to you so I can give you all the information you want quicker. So you can now go fix it. And he's going, yeah, I've really enjoyed this call too. Thank you. Because we have to reinforce what we want them to do more. And when people say, but that's like training a dog or training children, it's very hard to disagree, because that's exactly what we're doing, because you're not training the adult man. And this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand on both sides. We're training a child or a teenager whose emotional development got arrested for whatever reason at that age. Mm-hmm. And so they've grown into the man, but actually you're dealing with a much, much younger person. And if I said to you to train a teenager, or to, well, there's no training teenagers, if we're brutally honest, but you know what I mean, having got one, to train children and to train animals, it's consistency. This is what we want. This is consistent. And so that's what we do. So that was an example, to the extent now that she wrote to me recently and said, that's a really interesting statement, is my new favorite way of saying, I think you're talking shit. And then, you know, the other example of, he's got a personality. Well, she said, I hate my meetings with him. I said, why? He's a very senior director. And she said, because he's just bang, 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 bang. Detail, 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 detail. I just can't stand it. I said, well, he's the easiest man in the world to talk to. She goes, but I just don't know how. So, well, that's a different matter. I said, so how do you like to talk? And she said to me, I like to ease into conversations, you know, how you doing? What's going on? What's the weather? Blah, blah, blah. Deal with the situation that I'm having to report on and then finish. I said, right. I said, here's what to do. 5 minutes before the meeting's due to start, go and find somebody and talk about the weather. Go into the meeting and say, right, I've got 4 things I want to report back to you on. Which order do you want me to report them on? And he'll tell you, and you go, report. What's next? He'll tell you, report. Do that. Finish the meeting early because it'll go really quickly, and then go and find somebody else for 5 minutes to have a chat about anything you want. 4 weeks later, and that was last week, she came back to me in a training program and said, he's got a personality. I said, so come on, tell me, what have you done? Well, I went in and I literally said to him, right, I've got this many things to talk to you about. What order would you like me to go in? And so he told me and I answered it. And is there any other questions on it? He went, yes. So I answered them and he said, right, what next? And we finished the meeting quicker. I got out of there. I did that. I've had 2 meetings. You know, it's a regular weekly catch-up. I had 2 meetings with him and I did exactly the same thing on each meeting. And he was just his normal self. And then the 3rd time, the week before, I went in and he was like, hey, how you doing? And I was like, I looked over my shoulder to see if there was somebody behind me he was talking to. Anyway, I went, I'm fine. And we had a conversation. And then he said, right, what do you have for me this week? I said, well, I've got 4 things. Which ones do you want to chat about? That one. And then they talked about them as opposed to machine gun their way through it. Mm. And I said, so here's the thing. If I gave you 2 employees, and let's say you're an English person, and I give you 2 employees that they're going to be reporting to you, and they are in a safety critical role. And one of them is French and one of them is German. They both speak English, but not brilliantly. Would it help you as a manager, as their leader, to learn how to speak French and how to speak German? And of course, what do people say? Yes. And I say, why is it important that you learn to speak French and you learn to speak German? They go, well, we'll cut down on the likelihood of misunderstanding. of them not understanding what to do or getting something wrong. I said, absolutely. And I said, and because you're speaking French to the French person and German to the German person, they don't have to translate it. So they're relaxing because you're speaking to them in their language. So they relax, they can understand you absolutely, and they will create a much more dynamic relationship with you and a closer relationship quicker. And everyone goes to me, yes, absolutely. So when I then say to these people, let's say he's called David, the senior director, you have to learn to speak David. They go to me, but it's his responsibility because he's the director. Yes, it is. And yes, he is. And no, he won't. They, and I get a lot of this. I get a lot of, well, men have to, men have always done this and they need to change. And I'm saying you are right on every single level. I completely agree with you. And they're not going to change because they don't need to change because the world is geared up for them to be as they are. So if you want them to change, you're going to have to change. Well, why should I? Because you want to have a better relationship and a better experience and a better life. And if you can overcome the anger, the resentment, and the blame, which is there for very, very good reasons, and I'm not even going to remotely try and argue that point, you're right. But it'll change nothing. My great dream is to be able to work with women, to empower them to become the leaders that they've always been and that the world needs. And by leader, you can look at that from government to corporation to family to friendship. Just be the leader you've always been, because women are the most natural leaders.
I think that leads me to my final question. What does a world transformed by your vision look like?
Wow. I would like to see women prime ministers and presidents behaving in their most feminine form. So they bring their inclusion, they bring their collaboration, they bring their, if there's a different way, let's have a look at it and explore it. They bring those qualities to the heads of corporations, to the heads of countries, and they have the equivalent men also up there with them. So, men who have also learned to step beyond their insecurity. So they too can bring the best of them, being men, to the table and collaborative and understanding and inclusive. So we get the best of both genders working together at the highest level so that we can start to work on behalf of the planet, which people say, oh, that's very altruistic and high level. Actually, it's probably the most basic level for survival. If you look at Maslow and others like him, if we don't get the planet right, we're all in difficulty. And so my greatest hope is that if I can play any part in helping people, companies, and countries come together to work on behalf of the greater good, so you get first world countries with the money supporting third world countries where the tropical rainforest belt comes, so that we all realize that we should support them because we all benefit from having the forest. Cleaning up the oceans, we should all benefit from helping the countries doing the most. We should all help because we all benefit. And then how do we all work together in a way that businesses can thrive, societies can thrive, and the world can thrive, which is very, very altruistic. And, I wish for world peace, but actually it's built on really practical, basic understanding of economics and service, I think.
James, I want to thank you so much for sharing your vision. And I'm sure many people will really appreciate the conversation that we've had today. And thank you for being a guest on his podcast.
It's my absolute pleasure. And thank you for asking amazing questions, which I've never been asked before.
If you would like further details about James, then please follow links in the show notes.